Apple, front and center here, as it often is. One of the world's biggest companies, of course, hardware company, announced a new product, and I would say a fairly timely product, given that its price point much lower than its traditional iPhone products. In a time with a lot of uncertainty in terms of future earnings for a lot of people across the world. So how well received was this phone?
Pretty well. I mean, this doesn't compare to, a general product launch that Apple does, normally in the fall where they release an entire new lineup of products. But this phone is registering pretty well with the consumers. We see consumer demand for the 11 SE at 57% higher than what we saw a few years ago in the first SE launch that they did. And so that's a really nice uptick. And what we're seeing, the primary drivers behind that is what we're looking at. And Alex, you nailed it. I mean, it's about the phone being a good deal. It's about the price. Apple is basically coming out with something that kind of the world needs right now, and that is a cheaper way to get a new phone. People just don't have the financial stability to drop $1,200 on a phone right now. And so really nice timing, like you mentioned, and a pretty good release so far from what we see.
Andy, this falls in line with a conversation I once had with a mega car dealer in the Chicago area. And he owned BMW dealerships and he owned Chevy dealerships. And I was talking to him at dinner one night and I said, boy, you must make a lot of money off your very expensive cars. And he said, no, I don't make a lot of money off selling 1 or 2 BMWs. I make a lot of money off selling 500 of the more affordable cars. And that's exactly what I think Apple is doing here, is finding a better price point to appeal to a bigger pie of people buying iPhones. Is that what you think they're getting at? Because the price in your one chart looks like it's the biggest, the biggest factor in this new phone.
Yeah, that's the driving force behind why people are making the decision to buy this. It's, the idea of the price, the value. It's less about the features and more about the value that the user is going to get from this phone. I think that this kind of mid-year update to their product lineup is smart because, the early adopters, the true fanboys, as a lot of people call them, they're going to buy the latest and greatest in the fall at the $1,200 price tag. But now you come around, to April, and you've got the opportunity to pick up kind of the rest of the crowd with the lower dollar price point that can compete with a lot of Android devices in terms of price and value. And so I think that's what Apple's doing. So far, so good. And when we see, demand for the product at 57% higher than what we saw for a prior, kind of similar release from Apple, I think that bodes well for the strategy and the timing of what they're doing today.
I think that's a really, really interesting point, and especially given the demographic that you guys are monitoring, primarily, English-speaking tweets. I don't know if the U.S. is often considered, ultimately the price-sensitive demographic. This is also a phone that they're going to be able to market probably better to some of those more price-sensitive regions globally. And then something we talked about yesterday, Andy, in terms of where you're seeing as the primary maybe thing to focus on for growth going forward being 5G. Maybe this is kind of a stopgap for someone who breaks their phone in the interim, but wants to wait till they make that major investment into a 5G iPhone or Android device in the near future, and they buy this lower price point phone just to kind of get them by until then. Have you seen anything that you could tie those two together, or is that more speculation on my point?
I think it's valid speculation. We're not seeing the data that's going to say definitely that's what people are doing, but I think that makes complete sense. You're waiting kind of for the big release next fall. Your screen is broken or your phone is slowed down. This gives you the opportunity. This 11 SE gives you the opportunity to get a new phone and to do so pretty cheaply. I think it's also Apple's answer to a lot of the Android devices that have caught up in many ways in terms of functionality, and some of them, some make the case that they even lead in terms of functionality and technology, and at that lower price point. And so Apple coming with a lower price point model, I think. The other thing that this does is really highlights Apple's commitment to the services revenue that they generate. It's about getting more iPhones in more people's hands because they can generate recurring revenue on a regular basis from every single user that holds one of these or carries it in their pocket. And so getting those out there, even if it's at a lower price point, a lower profit margin, initially really falls right in line with their long-term strategy as a services business.
And it's almost like you read my mind there, Andy. Kevin, what I was about to ask you is I don't even necessarily think of Apple as a hardware company anymore in terms of MacBooks and iPads and iPhones that maybe we once did. This is an ecosystem company. This is a company that's looking to be involved in as many different things in an individual's life as they can, whether that's through their iPhone, whether that's through payments and Apple Pay, whether that's through the music they listen to in Apple Music. Basically across the board now, Apple has their hand in the pot in some way to try to be involved in so many of these different things. They're not just an iPhone company anymore, but it all starts with having that device. That's the launching point. So a new iPhone, lower price point, maybe opens their web just a little bit more to a little bit different demographic than they maybe originally were involved with.
Right. Apple used to be, 56% of their revenue and earnings used to come from the iPhone. That's down to 43%, 22% plus is now services. It's App Store and other services. So once the new idea from Apple that's going to kill, you just know it is, they get you in the ecosystem for a lower price point. And then all the other things surround you. And I can't imagine a scenario where this doesn't work and just keeps growing that percentage in terms of services and everything else they do in wearables and all things like that. Everything else that Apple gives you besides just the hardware, guys.
Andy, the question that I would have, though, in regards to this particular device and its impact potentially on Apple going forward would be it's really important probably for Apple that they get new consumers to buy this phone, Android users to convert to this new Apple iPhone as opposed to people who are already buying the more expensive version, whether that's for a replacement or not, as I'm sure it's got to be a lower margin product just given the fact that it's a cheaper price point.
Yeah, that's right. And I think what we'll see, what we're going to be looking for, because today's the first day that people actually are getting the phone in their hands. And so the reaction to that is very important. We've really found that over the last few years, there's one thing to react to a keynote event, and then there's another thing to react to when the physical device gets in your hand. And how does that play out in terms of, creating kind of that viral impact of, okay, I saw that someone has this phone, likes this phone, and so I'm going to buy this phone. So we have yet to see that come in. We have yet to see how well they're going to deliver technology-wise on the lower price point. Generally speaking, Apple does very well, but they have disappointed people in the past. And so we're going to be watching that over the next week or two to see, number one, are people happy with the phone that they receive? And number two, are there indications that this is a new experience for them? In other words, did they switch from an Android device, and is Apple gaining market share? So that's something we'll be watching closely over the next week or two as these things start to ship.
Well, one thing's for sure, Andy, as we start to wrap this up, Apple reports earnings next week. So we'll revisit Apple as a general company for sure. And maybe if you have any of those preliminary kind of insights into the sentiment around the first look at this new iPhone, once people unbox it, we'll double check there as well. But Kevin, kind of final thoughts here. If you have any questions for Andy as we wrap this up, obviously Apple, so much to talk about. We didn't even talk about the Apple Watch, the AirPods, everything. This is a company that continues to kind of have a stranglehold on at least certain parts of the market. Is there still opportunity even with this new phone to continue to grow their moat and grow market share?
It's so funny, guys. Apple is so rich at giving out information. I mean, the stock is up 1.3% today on news that they're making their own chips. And the Macs are going to be possibly not using Intel chips, but Apple's own chips going forward. Andy, are you guys seeing anything on social media about any of those mentions?
Yeah, mostly from investors. I think that investors are very interested in that. The consumer, I really don't think cares very much at all who makes the chip that's inside the phone,
Right.
as long as it works. But I will say, if we can get more people on these iPhone SEs, I'm going to just pitch this because I get so annoyed with the green bubble people and they ruin every group text that I'm in. So I'm hoping to see green bubbles turn
Agreed.
blue over the next couple of weeks, just from my own
That is
experience
such a good
standpoint, not really
point.
cheerleading the stock in any way. I don't have any position, but that's my hope as a consumer. We get rid of the green bubbles.
I couldn't agree
That's
with
such
you
a good
more. Nothing to
point.
do with the stock also, but just for a personal reason, just having not to see those green bubbles, I couldn't agree with you more. But Andy, kind of last thoughts here. I know we're going to double check this and talk about it more next week. But with Apple and all this to kind of unpack, the one thing that we can't write off either is that this is a company that was probably, better prepared for any type of a storm, given its balance sheet strength and the amount of cash it sits on, than really any other company. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, I think it's enormous. I think I would be surprised if we get through 2020 without some major acquisitions by Apple. I think this is the type of opportunity this is why you have all of those billions of dollars in cash, so that you can deploy them when the things that you're looking at get cheap. And so I think that's something to keep an eye on going forward. I'm sure Apple has a shopping cart of companies, services, products that it's been looking at acquiring for quite some time. And we'll see how all of this goes with, economically. But I think once we start to see some light at the end of the tunnel is when would be most likely for Apple to announce something fairly significant. We'll have to wait and see.
We'll look forward to that. But thanks for joining us as always, Andy, and you have a great weekend. We'll look forward to the conversations next week.